Today is Testimony Tuesday. You're about to hear an interview by Pastor Adam Dragoon in Virginia Beach as he asks one of our fellowship pastors about how God has radically changed their life. Be aware that the free version of Testimony Tuesday only includes the first half of the conversation. So make sure to check the show notes to find out how to subscribe to the premium version of the Taking the Land podcast. The premium version of this episode is released before you wake up each morning and does not include any interruptions or ads. Enjoy this Testimony Tuesday on the Taking the Land podcast.
All right, welcome back to Testimony Tuesday here on the Taking the Land podcast. This is Pastor Adam with you once again, and we are so glad that you're with us on this episode that is to be coming out in February. We're here in January recording this, and I am joined by our very special guest, Pastor Jason Garcia. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Adam. I really do appreciate the opportunity.
Very glad to have you here, and I appreciate the time. You are in Nicaragua, so for those who don't know you, including myself, why don't you take a moment here to give us like a 3 to 5 minute conference-style testimony of who you are, your wife, your kids, if they're there with you, and let us know what God's been doing.
My name is Jason Garcia. My wife, Angie Garcia. We are in Nicaragua. It's a city called Bluefields. You probably never heard of it. It's a small town. There's probably about 60,000 people. It's on the Caribbean side of Nicaragua. If you Google it, you're going to see blue water and like sandy beaches, but that's not true. It kind of deceiving. In Bluefields, there's brown water, but the people are beautiful and they're receptive to the gospel. We got here about 2 years ago in September. In September, it'll be 3 years this September. We got here, we got a building within 2 months, which was a miracle. We got it in a central area, which is where everybody goes to shop and that kind of thing. Actually, on the 15th, tomorrow, we'll celebrate 2 years that the church has been open. And we've just seen God do some powerful things. We have a core of people. Right now we have 2 couples that we're currently working with, and they are disciples, and they're a great blessing to the church. We were able to marry them. Here in Nicaragua, I don't have because I'm not a citizen or a resident, I can't marry people like legally. But we have a lawyer that cuts us a break and gives us a discount, and we marry them there. And then I say, okay, pick a day when you want to get married at the church and invite your family. So we've been able to marry 2 couples, and God's just doing a work here. And for me, it's a special time. I just feel like right now is a season in Nicaragua where people are very open to the gospel, and God's doing powerful things, if I could say it like that. I'm sure you can ask some more questions later about that.
That sounds amazing. Yeah. Well, I mean, every pastor wants to be wherever revival is, so that's powerful.
Absolutely.
And so for 2 years, had you been outside of the country before becoming a missionary?
Well, years ago, Pastor V had approached us about taking the church in Belize. And that's like maybe so long ago, probably about 15 years ago. And he had asked us who went to go look there. Me and my wife went and visited, and I preached a short revival. We looked at it, but it just didn't work out. But that was really the only other place I had preached as far as like a third world setting. Recently, I've been able to preach in Costa Rica, which was when we first got here, for Jim Greenfield, great guy, by the way. And, but that's about it. I hadn't really gone third world.
Okay.
Prior to that.
So you probably had some culture shock moving down there.
Oh my gosh. I'm still in culture shock right now.
Yeah.
It's definitely different. Well, here, there's no, we don't have like first world chains. There's no McDonald's here. There's no Pizza Hut. There's no Starbucks here. On Sunday, everything shuts down except for this restaurant that's only I think only in Nicaragua. I don't even know where it's called Tip Top. It's like a fried chicken place. Okay. So that's kind of our spot.
Okay.
After church. But that's about it. There's not much of anything, in Bluefields. So no Sam's Club, you know, a
Yeah. So
lot of culture shock.
you you do the daily type of shopping instead of the monthly type of shopping we do in the States,
Man,
right?
we just got like a supermarket, like where there's
Yeah.
AC. Yeah, where there's like AC and it's really lit up and, things like that. And like the produce are in like a cooler area, we just got one. So we like go there every other day just to go there to,
Yeah.
cause it's like home.
Yeah.
And, but that's a blessing, I'm going to try to make a carrot cake here pretty soon. My wife told me I'm not, but I'm going to try. Just because we got the ingredients now, for that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, daily shopping for
Yeah.
sure, daily shopping.
Yeah, no, I remember having to make that adjustment also when we went to Bulgaria. That was such a weird thing for us. Like you couldn't just go to one Walmart and get everything you need.
I'm telling you. So
you got to
this
go
is
to
what I
this
tell.
place for the produce and that place for the meat and that
Yes,
place over there. Yeah, and yeah,
yes, and it's like I don't think people understand in America the convenience of going to one store.
yeah,
Like this would be our routine if we were going to get something. Say, okay, what do we need? And you would go to this little vendor on the side of the road where they have the vegetables. The
right.
potatoes still have dirt on them. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah.
And then we go
That's
up.
called organic.
Yeah, yeah. And we go up and we go to the corner and then that's where we get our meat. And then like if they don't have the meat that you're looking for, you're like, all right. So then you go up the road, you go to the next store and they don't have the meat that you're looking for. You're like, all right. Then you go, by the time you're done, you're like, you know what, dude, I don't even care. I'm just saying
It's a whole day. Yeah.
beans and rice, that's it. I can't find no meat. I'm tired of looking. That's it. I'm done. Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah,
like that sometimes. Sometimes,
I f-
sometimes
I
you'll
feel
have
your
days
pain.
where sometimes you'll have days like everything works. The stars align and the planets align and it's great. You get a cab. You can get a cab where there's nobody in it. It's just you and your wife and your groceries. My Lord, that's a blessing right there.
Oh man.
But
See,
anyway,
see, this is not the part they advertise on the Thursday night World Evangelism video, right?
man, you know, if anybody were to ask me, I'll be straight up. Like, where are you going? If you're going somewhere where there's modern amenities, you'll be out. But if
Yeah.
you're going to go to third world, be prepared to be stretched in
And you know
all
what?
manner.
It has to be a calling. It has to be
It
God,
does.
because otherwise it's just a pain in your neck, right?
You know, I had a moment probably about a year in, and I was like, actually, I listened to a sermon that you had put on the podcast, Artie Aragon,
Oh yeah.
and he was talking about calling, and he was saying how he was in on the Reds, and he was like, how Artie Aragon does it. What are you doing? Why are he's doing that kind of thing that he does, and he said that God spoke to him, said, because I called you here. That's why.
Mm. Yeah.
I called you here. And I had that moment with God where God was like, I called you here. You were called to be here. That's why you're here. Because I called you. That's why you're here.
Wow.
But anyway, I'm here.
Man.
It's all good.
Well, that is very enlightening and that's very inspiring to me because you heard that on a sermon that we posted on the podcast. So this
Yeah.
is this is why we do this. It's not just to support world evangelism, but for opportunities like that God can speak to people, in exact opportune moments. So that's very encouraging. Thank you for that.
Yeah, man. This is a great podcast. It's a
Hey,
lifesaver, life changer,
well, Pastor Garcia,
inspiring.
I would love to jump into your story. For those who don't know you, why don't you share a little bit about how and where you grew up and family life? What was it like for you?
Okay, so I'm from a small town about 45 minutes south of Austin called San Marcos, Texas, Texas State University. Maybe you watch football, but from that part of Texas, my family life, it was really bad. Me, my younger brother, and my parents, my family was broken. My my father was a really bad alcoholic, and you find out stuff later when you get older, but he was involved in drugs. My mom worked like two jobs to support me and my little brother, and she worked at Texas, well, back then it was Texas State University, Southwest Texas, And she worked there in the athletic department, and then she worked at night at the cafeteria there in the university. So she supported me and my brother. But my dad was a wild man. And so that's how we
Mm.
grew up. You know, my parents, they fought a lot. They cursed at each other. They would, my dad would punch holes in the walls and, you know, crazy things like that. You know, growing up, he, you know, we find out this stuff later. I'm not sure how long he was doing it, but he was selling marijuana at the time. He was selling weed. I think he was even selling cocaine. Like, this is stuff we didn't know. We found out later. But you know, my mother, she was always depressed and trying to figure life out. You know, you know, we she tried everything. You know, she tried religion, and you know, she tried to be nice, and she tried to be mean, and you know, just everything. She tried to fix things with her and my father, but they ended up getting divorced. Maybe, I think, when I was probably, I think maybe 7 years old or something like that. And they got
Mm.
divorced. But the problem is, my parents never left each other alone. You know, they still would see each other, and my dad would still come over, and he would stay, and then they would get mad at each other. Then they would leave. Then he would leave. That's the way we lived for the majority of our life. And that's kind of how we grew up in a broken home. And
Mm.
God totally changed all that as we got older. You know, I remember one day my parents had gotten in a really big fight. We lived in the projects, and I think that at that time my dad was selling cocaine. I think my mom got in a really big fight with him about it. And so my dad beat her up. And
Mm.
when I mean like beat her up, he beat her up, and he put her in intensive care. And I remember he took my little brother, he took him, he left me, and my uncle who had lived down the street came and picked us up, and went to the hospital. And it's hard to see your mom. You know, she's got the oxygen in her nose, and she's
My gosh.
swollen. She's got like marks on her neck, and I don't know if you know what an arm blaster is. This is an old thing back in the days where it's like a spring, and the bodybuilders would kind of pull it down. But he hit her with one of those on the side of her leg, and I remember seeing this giant bruise on the side of my mother's leg. And so, but the crazy part is that like a month later, my parents were together again, and it was like nothing happened. But for me, you know, I still remembered, you know, and you grow up, and you grow up with a lot of hate. You
Oh yeah.
question things, you know. And so, you know, when I was about 13, I had got a girlfriend. I was involved in sports, football, martial arts, boxing. And like I said, I had a girlfriend. I had started watching pornography very bad, even before that, probably about at the age of like 8 years old, 7, 8 years old, just because it was there in my house. So you got to remember, there's all these things psychologically going on in my mind. You know, I hate my father because of the life that he has given us, and the hate that he's shown my mom. And so I'm feeling all this rage, you know. And my dad had gotten put in jail for abusing my mom at one
Mm.
point in time. So he went to jail for a little bit, and then he came out. So he didn't touch her for a long time. And so, but at about 13, 14 years old, I got all these things going on in my life. And I remember he tried to hurt my mom again. And I was like, oh man, I'm 13. I'm lifting weights. You know, I'm wild. I'm like a wild horse, you know. And then I think I'm a man. I'm a man because I'm already having sex and stuff like that. So, you know, we get into this gigantic fight. We're driving home, and he he hits my mom in the face in front of me and my little brother, my cousin. And I was like, that's it. I'm not a little boy no more. I'm not gonna let you put your hands on my mom anymore. And I was in the back seat, and I slapped him from the back seat, around his ear. So I don't know if you've ever been hit in the ear before, but it does not feel good. So I'm talking full on. That's it. Boom! Like I'm as much strength as I could, and my mom stopped the car. She was driving, and she stopped the car, and she's like, "Look at what you're doing." So everybody gets off the car. My mom, my dad, they're they're cussing at each other. They're fighting with each other. My little brother goes up to my dad, and he tries to like tell him to stop, and he pushes my little brother. Mind you, we're on the side of the road. There's traffic passing back and forth. So it made me so mad that my own father would do that to his son, to my brother. I mean, we only have one dad. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so he pushes him, and that's it. I can't take it anymore. And I remember just, you know the phrase, I just saw red. That's like what
Snap.
happened. I snapped. I couldn't take it no more. Everything, the emotional pain, the rejection, the anger, I think I'm a man, like I said, because I'm having sex and I'm watching pornography and I'm lifting weights. I'm just a wild child. And man, I just let loose everything on my father that day. And we got into a big fight on the side of the
Oh
road.
man.
And,
Crazy.
at this time, UFC had just come out, you know, and like I said, I was boxing, doing other martial arts and stuff like that, ground and pound, the UFC fighter mounts the guy and he's like
Oh,
coming
yeah.
down on,
Yeah. Yeah.
man, that's what happened. That's exactly what I did to my father. And
Oh my gosh.
when I finally got up, I was just kicking him. I was angry. My mom was like, "Let's go. They're going to call the police. You're going to get in trouble. Let's go." We left my dad on the side of the road and we took off
Oh.
to the house. We took off to the house. My mom was so terrified. She's like, "When your dad comes, this is not going to be good." And I remember we got to the house. He was there before us. And I was like,
What
my
in the
mom
world?
was like, "Yes, exactly." We were like, "How does this work?" This is a time where there's no cell phones. You know what I mean? You can't just be like, "Hey, come pick me up." You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And he ended up at the house before we were. And he kind of like, we walked in and he gave my mom an ugly look. He gave me an ugly look. And he went to his room and we left him alone. And I remember that night because I was like, man, this is going to kill me
Mm.
when I go
Yeah.
to sleep.
Yeah.
When I go to sleep. But that's kind of my childhood, that
Wow.
it was crazy like that. I can tell you more stories about how the madness was. We always only had one car because my dad would ruin a car, drinking and driving or something like that. And they had gotten into a fight. At this time, I was probably working and on my own, and I was probably like 16, maybe 15, 16. And so he was going to take the car from us, and he was fighting with my mom. He's going to take the car from us. And I was like, I need that car. I can't let him take this car. So, I'm a teenager and I'm not thinking. And I jump on the car. I'm like, you can't take this car. My mom needs to go to work and I need to go to work. And you're just going to go cruising around acting foolish. I jump on the car. He takes off with me on the car.
Oh my
And I'm
God.
like, what is happening? So I ended up getting on top of the car, like on not the hood, but on the very top of the car. And he's driving in the neighborhood. He's driving crazy. And I managed to get the door open. I grabbed my dad and I yanked him out of the car. He rolls around in the street. I jump in the car. I get control of the car and I leave him there and I take off back to the house with the car. I'm
Oh
like,
my
nobody's
gosh.
taking this car. But, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. This is
like
not exactly a healthy environment.
no, it's not. He was raising a killer, to be honest with you. That's why I tell people all the time. You want to fight in front of your kids. You want to drink alcohol. You want to do drugs. You want to beat up your wife. You want to fight like that. You're going to raise a killer because that's the kind of environment a killer is in.
Mm.
Someone who doesn't care. you know, but that's the kind of the way, that's the way life was, for us. I had gotten a girlfriend at 13. It's my wife now, but, so that was kind of my only escape, is being with her. I would watch her family. She had a good family.
Oh,
And,
wow.
her
Yeah,
parents,
I was going to ask you, like, when did you realize that this is not normal? When did you realize that this was not good, this kind of environment?
I tell this to people all the time, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation,
Yes.
Chevy Chase.
Yeah.
I would watch that movie over and over. And I would be
Seriously.
like, yes, I would be like, man, I want to be like Clark W. Griswold. And I would say, man, I want my life to be like this. This guy's got his family. They come over for Christmas. He's like the man, you know what I mean? Like if you ever seen this movie, but scratch the part, where everybody's annoying him. But just the idea of, he's the guy trying to keep everybody together and wanting them to be together for Christmas. And I would watch that movie over and over. I'd be like, man, I want to be like that guy. I want my life to be like that, And so when I got with my wife, mind you, we were 16, she would invite me to, and her family, like, her mother and father had gone to church when they were young, when she was younger. They were part of the Assemblies of God. And so my father-in-law had a powerful conversion. He was, he was alcoholic, drugs. He was one of the guys that would go play softball and be out there for hours and hours and drink while they were there. But, he was a good man. And so he had gotten converted, in the Assemblies of God, and he felt the call of God to preach. And so my wife kind of grew up in that environment for a little bit. But when she became a teenager, for some reason, I think my father-in-law just didn't understand to have a balance in his life. And so I think he was kind of discouraged because maybe my mother-in-law at the time wasn't really into it, as serious as he was, because he had an actual conversion. And I think he was kind of discouraged. I don't think that, I don't know how the Assemblies of God are. I just know some things. I think if he would have gotten saved in a fellowship like ours, I think it would have been a little bit different. I think he would have had somebody tell him, hey, man, it's okay. You got to have a balance. You don't got to stay in your room 24 hours a day and read your Bible. You can come out and, because he was really involved with my wife and my brother-in-laws. And so he was a good man. That's kind of her upbringing. But her families are the families that would get together for Christmas, like all the families, like all the the grandmothers and the grandmother's sisters, And so they would have those, and she would invite me, and I would go, and I'd be like, is this what it's like to, not have to fight on Christmas? Like, this is crazy. I think that was part of the attraction to my wife, is that I was like, wow.
Stability.
Yeah, I wanted that. I really wanted that. And to this day, man, I love my father-in-law. He's the kind of man that will never say like, good job, love you, proud of you, son-in-law. He'll never say that. But he's always been the stable thing, in my life from the age of 13 till now. I'm 42 years old.
Wow.
And so we have our relationship is not the best, but I love him. I respect him because he's never, he's always been there for his family. And so,
kind of a polar opposite to your experience.
Sure. And so that was one of the things that I saw, and I was like, my life is crazy, and, it was like that for a while. I had gotten my wife pregnant when we were 16 years old. Like
Time
I
to
said,
grow up?
yeah, well, the thing was, I was already living like I was grown. When I turned 16, I was able to get a job where I was able to make my own hours and, stuff like that. And, I was already working almost, 30 hours, 40 hours a week, and I was only 16. So I was making my own money. I was buying my own food, buying my own clothes. I was giving my mother money so that my dad wouldn't have to, that kind of thing. So I felt like I was grown. Like I said, I'm having sex. I'm only 13. I'm living like a grown up, and, I had gotten my wife pregnant, and when you're 16 and you think that your girlfriend's pregnant, you're like, oh dang, this is gonna get, this could be good or it could be bad. I remember I was sitting at home and I hear the phone ring, the house phone ring. I said like, oh man, who's that? My mom answered it. My mom's, I could hear my mom. She's like, uh-huh. Are you sure? Does he know about this? You know? And so my mom came into my room, I'm watching TV. And she's like, did you know that Angie's pregnant? And I said, who said that? I'm still trying to lie, you know, I'm still trying to lie. And she's like, Sylvie just called me. Sylvia's my mother-in-law. So Sylvie just called me. She said that Angie's in the hospital and she might be pregnant. And I was like, all right. And she's like, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, what do you mean? What am I going to do about it? I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to school. I'm working. I'm making my money, And she's like, I remember my mom, she wanted to tell me something like, get after me, like probably beat me up. At this point, I was living my own life, I mean, my mom was too busy fighting with my dad, trying to survive. And I was already, living my life, And so she told me that. And I remember my mother-in-law, my father-in-law were like, we need y'all to come to the house. We need to talk about this. So my dad got drunk, of course, before we went over there.
No.
And my mom's, she's a nervous wreck, and she's ready to fight because she knows it's going to be, there's going to be words. So I walk up to the door and my father-in-law's standing at the front door. And he said, I said, Gilbert, I want to apologize. And he stopped me. He's like, you ruined my daughter's life. That's what you did.
Wow.
And so I'm like, what do you say? You're 16. And he's like, you ruined my daughter's life. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. We walk in and we're talking. Mind you, my dad's had a lot to drink, so he's like, you know what I mean? Like he's like drunk face, and so my father-in-law was like saying stuff like, what are we gonna do about this? Where's the baby gonna stay? How are y'all gonna do this? I don't think I don't think they should get married. I don't think any of that stuff. He's just a kid and blah blah blah. And my mom's like, yeah, you're right. And my dad's like, yeah, whatever you say, man, And so my father-in-law said something like, well, it's not like I can beat somebody up with a bat, because my father-in-law is a very aggressive person, And he's like, it's not like I can beat somebody up with a bat. And my dad was like, he kind of got like stood up like, what are you talking about? Like, of course you can't beat somebody up with a bat. There was two people here. You know what I mean? And so it's kind of like that. And I finally just said, you know what? We're going to go ahead and go. I said, it's funny because my wife, again, we're boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. We're 16. She's in the room. She's like, I don't want no part of what's going on here, And, but anyway, we left there. And so it was like, that was it for my relationship with my in-laws at the time. They were like, I hate this kid, which they had every right to. The reason why my father-in-law had said that was because my wife played softball. She's a very good softball player. She probably could have gotten a scholarship to a university or something like that, but I got her pregnant. That was kind of like what my father-in-law was banking on, is that, I always feel like he wanted her to go to university. And so, like every parent would want their daughters to do. You have daughters, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
you want
Right.
them to do good for themselves, Of course, you want them to grow up and be a good wife, and a good mother. But as a father, you try to teach your girls like, hey, you need to be able to take care of yourself just in case, But, that was kind of the beginning of our life, and, she had my older son. He was born. I had just turned 17 when he was born. And she almost died in the delivery room. And she had a lot of complications. So she started thinking like, man, where would I have gone if I died? Mind you, she grew up in, my father-in-law, he had a conversion experience. So she had already been introduced to Jesus and the gospel and things like that. And so she was like, man, if I died, where would I have gone?
That
So
turned into a spiritual wake-up call for her, huh?
for her, yes. For her, yes.
Yeah.
And so So she went back to school, and there was a substitute teacher that was there. Her name was Heather Anderson. And so Heather Anderson is the wife of Andy Anderson, who was the pioneer of the church in San Marcos. And
Okay, got it.
so, uh, Heather Anderson was a witnesser. She would be in high school when she was working in the high school when we were in high school. And so she would be working there, substitute teaching, and she would witness to people, She would witness to the workers. One of the workers that she witnessed to was my mother-in-law. And so she witnessed to my mother-in-law. She invited her to church. And so I want to say in like 96, 96 or 97, we got invited to the church. No, probably maybe 96. We got invited to the church. And so she invited my mother-in-law. They were showing a movie, and Heather Anderson invited my mother-in-law, and we got invited to the movie. And we were there. It was, what was there? It was like Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames back in the day when it was recorded, on tape. And so we watched it. We're like, wow, this is crazy. They would invite my mother-in-law to revivals, and she would invite us. And so we would go. And, I remember that's probably the very first time I went to the church, but I didn't feel nothing. I was just a teenager. I had a lot of other stuff on my mind. So Heather Anderson saw Angie at the high school. So she's like, hey, how's your mom? How are you doing? Angie's like, well, I had a baby, blah, 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 just kind of, nonchalantly talking to her. So then Heather Anderson had the house number. So she would call and follow up on my mother-in-law and Angie. And so Heather Anderson would call the house, and my father-in-law would answer, and she'd be like, hey, he's like, they'd be like, don't tell him I'm here. And so he'd be like, no, she's not there. She's like, well, is Angie there? Can I talk to Angie? And Angie'd be like, tell him I'm not here. Don't tell her I'm not here. And so, but that was kind of like the beginning of the introduction to the church. And so, my wife would drive by the church, every day to go to school, and she's like, man, I need to get my heart right after she had my son. So she started going to church. She was about 18. She was about 18. So she started going to the church, and she had an encounter with God, And so one day she was like, hey man, I can't do this with you no more. And I'm like, do what? She's like, I can't just be, the way we're living is wrong. And I don't know if I want to be with you. I want something different for my life. And I was like, I don't understand. She's just like, look, Jesus is real. And I'm like, I laughed at her. I said, this is my exact words. And I hate to say that I said it like this. I said, are you dumb or what? I was like, God's not real. The devil's not real. None of this stuff is real. The only thing the preacher wants is your money. That's why he does what he does, you know? And she's like, I don't care what you say. I'm going to go to church. And she said, if you want anything to do with me or your son, then you'll come to church. And so, so I said, fine, whatever.
That's
I'll
pretty
go.
good motivation.
Yeah, because the truth is, like I said, remember, I want to be Clark W. Griswold, and I can't be if she says, I don't want to have nothing to do with you. You understand what I'm saying? And so I started going to the church, and I would go here and there, and I would go with an attitude like I didn't really want to be there. Like I was just there because they're making me be there. And I would show up, not dress, go like in a muscle shirt and shorts. You know what I mean? I got into an argument with the nursery worker, because I wanted to see my son. I hadn't seen him. Because remember, she doesn't want me to see him if I'm not going to church. So I got into an argument with the nursery worker. She's like, hey, you can't come in here, and get him all riled up and then leave. And I got in her face and said, no one's going to tell me what I can and can't do with my kid. That's my kid. That's not your kid. That's my kid. And so anyway, this is going on for about 6 months. Me coming to church every now and then, you know what I mean? I had gotten word that somebody had liked my 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 wife, remember we're boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. I had gotten word that somebody was interested in her, and I was like, oh, fuck, no, this is my girl. No one's taking my girl. So then I had to go to church even more, and then when I had fellowships, and they would have like fellowships, and they would invite me, so I would go. At that time in the church, there was a lot of young people around the same age, between the ages of like 18 to like 21, and so I'm going, and I hear this guy, he's like making jokes, and my wife's laughing. I'm like, all right, that's my competition right there. You know what I mean? And so anyway, so I went, and I was going more often. I was a teenager. I wasn't really part of the church, just kind of going because they would invite me, and because, like I said, I heard my wife might be talking to somebody, and I just I need to be there every time they have something to make sure this guy doesn't, you know, take my girl. But anyway, I went, I saw Pastor Anderson get sent out, and that was kind of my first impression of what we do as a church. I didn't really understand it at the time. Like I said, I didn't understand. Everybody was crying. There was tears. And I was like, why is everybody crying for Pastor Anderson? Why is everybody crying for this white guy? That's what I thought. And Pastor Pettis came in, Pastor Roland Pettis, who's pastoring in Austin right now, Austin, Texas. And he came in. And so that was right around the time where things got really bad between me and my father, even worse than they were when I was younger. So in October, there was like a escalation between me and my dad, like as far as fighting and stuff like that. I remember one day my mom, they were fighting. I tried to ignore it, and my dad was he had hit my mom, and so I went to the room and I grabbed him, and I just started pounding on him, and then I had him on the ground. But this time I was so mad that I tried to choke him. Like, I just wanted it to be over. Like, I was so angry. I wanted it to be over. So I started choking him. And so my mom was like, get off of him. My dad is starting to turn colors. His tongue is sticking out. And it's like, my mom and my brother were like, hey, get off of him. You're going to kill him. What I didn't know was that my dad had called my grandmother. So she heard everything that was happening on the phone, on the house phone. So she hung up the phone and she called the cops, and the cops they were on their way to the house. So I jumped in the car. After this, I got off with him, and my mom was like, you need to get out of here. So I left, and I went to like the closest public place to us was like a Walmart. And I remember going to the Walmart, and I got pulled over by like 4 cop cars and not a state trooper, sheriff's department. Because where we lived, there was a sheriff's department. It was their district. So 4 cop cars pull me over, and they're like, are you Jason Garcia? Blah, blah, blah. They're like, we got a domestic violence call, and you're the problem. We're going to take you in. But there was a sheriff's department police officer, and he saw me, he recognized me because he had been to the house a bunch of times. And so he asked me what had happened, and I told him what had happened. I said, my dad hit my mom. I wasn't going to let him hit her. And I tried to stop him, and I choked him. I didn't kill him. He's there at the house. He's alive. And he was like, I don't want you to go back home. Let me talk to these guys. So he talked to all the policemen. One by one, they began to go. And he pulled me aside when everybody left. He said, I don't want you to go back home. You need to stay away for a day till your dad sobers up, until all this cools down. I'm like, you're not going to arrest me? He's like, no, I'm not going to arrest you.
Man,
so
he saved your bacon.
Yeah, he did, because I would have gotten arrested for like attempted murder, or like aggravated assault,
Or manslaughter, at least, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I remember sleeping in the parking lot at the Walmart in San Marcos. And then I went home, and my dad was still there. And I was in my room laying down. That morning when I got there, I finally fell asleep. I had a bat with me, and he came into the room, and he kind of like gave me a dirty look, and he walked out. So like that kind of stuff, it happened like for a whole week. And so at that time, mind you, my wife, she's like starting to get involved in the church and changing, and kind of leaving me behind as far as like spiritually, you know what I mean? Because I don't want anything. I just doing this because I want to see my son, you know? And so she's like, hey, why don't you come to the haunted house that we're having? And I was like, stupid. You know, like that's all I could think about in my head. Like, this is stupid. The church is gonna put on a haunted house. I'm like, all right, whatever. I went to the haunted house. Mind you, I got a bunch of stuff on my mind, like all that happened with my father. I'm contemplating life because at that time I kind of like one of the nights I didn't help my mom. You know, I couldn't hear my dad, and it was like God was dealing with me, like, hey, you can't do this. And I remember thinking, like, what's going to happen to my life if I continue this way? So I kind of like God was kind of like speaking to me. That was kind of my first, you know, introduction to God, like dealing with my heart about certain things that I was doing. And so that day I went to the haunted house. My wife was involved in the haunted house. I was like, I walked in, they were like, here, you pay your 2 cans of food goods and you can get them for free. And I remember I went with my wife's cousin and we were there and I was like, man, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. Like I had an attitude like that, you know? And, at the end though, Pastor Perez was preaching. You know, he's a short man, but man, that day he was like 8 feet tall, you know? And when he began to preach, it was like everybody disappeared except for me. And he's preaching. And it wasn't hell that scared me because in my head I was like, nothing could be worse than the life that I'm living right now. But he said, you want to know what it's like to have the Father's love, a love that's unconditional. And I get emotional thinking about this
Wow.
because I wanted that so much for my life, you know. I wanted a love that like it was like unconditional, you know, and I didn't know where to get it because I kept looking for it, you know. Remember, I want to be Clark W. Griswold in my family and everything like that. And you know, he's preaching and I remember looking over at my wife's cousin. I remember thinking, this dude really needs Jesus, you know? And I'm thinking, I wonder if he's gonna raise his hand. But it was crazy because my hand went up and I don't know why my hand went up. It was like, I don't know, maybe I was thinking like if I raise my hand and my wife's cousin raised his hand because he really needs Jesus, you know. But my hand went up and I remember praying that day and receiving Jesus for the first time. Because remember, I was going to church. I never really answered an altar call, you know. But that was the first time that I prayed, and I remember thinking to myself, "There's no way that this is it. Like, there's no way that has forgiven me for the things that I've done, for the things that I've said, the way I mocked him, my attitude towards him. There's no way that God has forgiven me for that kind of stuff." But I had felt, for the first time in my life, I felt free, and I felt hope, you know, and like the weight of the world was taken off my shoulders. And I remember afterwards, like, I stuck around because again, my wife is there and, you know, I'm kind of like, hey, do you need anything? I'm fixing to leave, blah, blah, blah. It was the last run of the night. And, she's like, no, I'm fine. I'm like, Christopher's my son. I'm like, does Christopher need anything? She's like, no. And so they were working on tearing it down. I was like, maybe I could help. So I started helping, you know, and they were like, who's this kid? You know? And, they're like, that's Christopher's dad, you know, and this Angie's baby daddy, you know. And so I felt different after that. And it I would say uh that was my introduction to really, really surrendering my heart to God. And after that it was different, you know, my parents would fight and that was like the conviction of God would would come upon me because I really wanted to protect my mother and keep my father from doing the things that he was doing. You know, um, you have to understand that I had no rules at my house. You know, no rules. I mean, my father would smoke weed and be like, "Come on, let's smoke." You know, I was in junior high and he wanted me to sell cocaine for him, and I was like, "I don't want to be like you, man." Like, this is before salvation, but I was like, I don't want to be like you. I don't even like you. Why would I want to do what you do? Like, that was kind of my mentality, you know. And when I got saved, it just felt right that I needed this to change my life. And so we ended up getting married, me and my wife, a year later. God just began to do a work in my life. We got married in December of 2000. My parents started coming to church and they got remarried, and like I think it was June of 2000. My my parents had been
Wow,
going to
that's
church.
incredible.
Yeah, my parents started going to church, and you know, my mom's she was a Catholic, so that kind of service that we had was kind of like out of the ordinary for her. You know, we'd speak in tongues and worship God. She was like, "What is happening?" You know, that kind of thing. But I think that she knew that God was doing something in my life, and she was curious. You know, and same with my brother. You know, they would come to church. My little brother would come, and mind you, I was already married. I'd gotten married, and you know, I was living with my wife and my son. We were away from home, and my mom and dad would come to church, and they would bring my brother. He was a teenager at the time. And one day I told him, I was like, "When are you gonna get saved, man? You know, Jesus loves you." He's like, "Jay, none of this stuff is real. Like, why do you keep saying this? And why don't you know why we come here? Nothing's gonna change." And I remember he was so mad that he was like crying, like, "You're so dumb. Why are you doing this?" You know, he was like into heavy metal and stuff like that. You know, long hair, black fingernails. He was in a band, you know. And I said, "Jesus loves you, man." And he went to boot camp that same year and got saved, got filled with the Holy Ghost at boot camp, came back. He was
Thank
different.
God for boot camp.
Yeah, you know, and there was a lot of stuff that took place that year, that first year that we got, you know, when we got married. There was a lot of things that happened. You know, my parents, like I said, they got remarried, and they got married because Pastor Perez didn't know my parents weren't married. And so they were going to go to Tucson conference. And I don't know who said something, but they found out that my parents weren't married. He found out my parents weren't married. He's like, "You're not married?" He's like, we're gonna sing to Tucson. What do you mean you're not married? You know? So he's like, "You need to get married." So they got married, you know, on like a Saturday, and you know, that kind of thing. But you know, we went to Tucson for the first time, and so we're in Tucson, and it was uh it was on a Wednesday. Gene LaValle preached. He was the third guy in the morning, and he preached a sermon called "Why Not You, Why Not Now?" And I remember before all this, like God's like dealing with me, like, what am I going to do for God? And everybody around is like, "Man, you know, we want to be preachers, whatever," right? I'm like, "I don't even know that, man. I can barely read, you know? I don't even know I'm young. You know what I mean? Like, I just got married. I don't even know what I want to do with my life, you know, like that kind of thing." And so Gene Valley preached a sermon called "Why Not You, Why Not Now?" And every excuse that I had, he like, he named them in the sermon. Like that was his 3 points. Why you don't want to preach the gospel. You know what I mean? And so he gave all my excuses. Again, I feel like I'm the only person in the room. I don't talk to my wife. I'm just listening. And I go to the altar and I'm crying. I'm like, "Okay, God, if you can take my life, you can have it. I don't know what you want from it because I can't offer you anything, but you can have it." What I didn't know is that God was speaking to my wife at the same time, the same thing. "I want to use your life." So we're both going at the altar. We're both crying. And afterwards, I'm like, "What did God say to you? Like, why are you crying?" And she's like, "Why are you crying?" I said, "Well, I'm crying because God's dealing with me about doing something for God." Like now I understand it was preaching and becoming a pastor, but at the time I just felt overwhelmed with the feeling of, man, I have to do something for God because look at what God's doing in my life. He's done so much, you know? And so after that, it was like, I wanted to be a disciple. You know, I mean, like I said, I didn't understand this stuff then, but I understand it now. I wanted to be a disciple. And so, you know, we just did our best to serve, you know, in any way we can. If it was cleaning the church, you know, or helping in the parking lot, or you know, that kind of back in those days, we'd have some older ladies that would come to church, And I'd be like, let me park your car. You know what I mean? Like valet parking at the church, and they would get off. I grab the car, park it for them. Pastor Fred doesn't ask for none of that. I was just like, this is what I should
Wow.
do, you know?
Yeah.
And, eventually we became like his Bible study assistants, for like team Bible study, because we were so young. But that's the story of how we got saved and how God began to use our life. We were
Man,
we got saved when we were
what an
18.
incredible journey.
Yeah. Yeah, we got saved when we were 18 and we got married when we were 19. We got sent out when we were 23
When
years
you
old.
think about this and when you tell this story, I'm just curious, is it hard for you to think back on that lifestyle that you were living back then? Because, now you mentioned you're 42 years old, so it's more than half of your life ago. Does it seem hard to believe that was the same person?
No, man, I know who I am. I know who I was. You know what I mean? I know who I was. I know what God saved me from. And it's every time I look in the mirror, like, I'm not trying to be over spiritual. I'm just being honest. Like, I look in the mirror, I know who I am. I know that whatever I have is because because of God. That's why coming here and the sacrifice that we made to come here, it was like I had to say yes. I had to say yes. I had to say yes because of everything that he had done in my life. So, but no, I know the person that I am. I know what God saved me from. I know what he did in my life. And I just thank God that he took me from that place. And I thank God for the miracle that he did in my family.
So another question I had for you, thinking about your story, is when you said your life began to change. Well, the reason that you surrendered was because you saw your wife begin to change, and then God caught up with you at a haunted house of all places. And your life, you immediately started to change because instead of being cynical and looking at it from a wicked point of view, all of a sudden you're wanting to help out with tearing things down. So I guess when your life started to change, then your family started to come also, right? And your mom and dad. So I'm just wondering about the dynamic of now you're having to serve God or come to church with your dad, who you mentioned before that you hated him, and your mom. And I'm sure that there was some, like, I've talked to other pastors who have been through a family situation like that, and the anger that you have, of course, is directed at dad because he's beating up on your mom. But then you're also kind of angry at mom because why are you putting up with this? Why don't you do something about it? And so I could imagine that, now you're having to navigate what does it look like to serve God and I'm just curious, what was that like? Was there some awkward moments for you, or was there some forgiveness that had to happen?
Yeah, there was a lot of awkward. My parents would come to church. Remember, I'm married. I don't live at home no more. I'm living my own life. When I say that my parents got married, and that kind of thing, my dad had a lot of struggles even afterwards. And he was still like in and out of church. He was still drinking. He was still doing drugs and stuff like that. He was still fighting with my mom, and yeah, there was a lot of that, probably I want to say for the first year that they were coming to church, I was struggling because my dad he would go into these, like these times where he would just binge and he would just get drunk and he would fight with my mom, and my mom would leave, and, my mom would try to come to my place. And so back then we had an answering machine in our telephone. And so we would leave, go somewhere, and I would come back and it'd be like 20 messages. And they were all my dad. And the messages would be like, where's your mom at? You need to call me back. Bye. Then it'll be like, I know your mom's there. I know she's messing with some man. I know you're okay with it. You don't want me to be around. Hang up the phone. And they would escalate. And then like the last 5 messages were like, Jay, call me back. I need to know what's going on. I love you. All right. Bye. And it was like, and then he would show up at the house, at the apartment. It'd be like 3 a.m. and just be like, boom, 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 banging on the door. And I'm like, what is happening? And it'll be my dad. He'd be like, where's your mom at? I know she's here. And I'm like, she's not here, Dad. I don't know what's wrong with you. And there was a time where my mom would like try to escape at our house, but it was like my mom was bringing this craziness to my house. Remember, I'm saved. My wife's saved. I'm trying to raise my son in a different environment than what I grew up in. And so my wife's like, hey man, we need to decide what we're going to do here, because I'm not going to put up with this. You got married, you're saved. You need to make a decision here what we're going to do. And she's like, you need to talk to your mom, and it's like, this is my mom, man, and I've done my whole life is try to protect my mom. And so I had a hard conversation with my mom. And the conversation was like, Mom, I can't let you just come here whenever you get crazy with dad. And then you don't want to do nothing about it. You don't want to say anything. You don't want to call the police or nothing like that. I can't, Mom, I'm sorry. And so my mom was like, fine, whatever. So it's just, she's still coming to church, and my dad's still coming to church after all that stuff is going on. And so we went to Tucson again the next year. Again, my parents go, and it's just crazy because, thinking about it now, it's like God was speaking to my parents, but it was like my dad was like, I don't know what was going on in his head at that time. I got an idea of what was happening, but I don't really, I'm not really sure because, he's passed away. I never really asked him these questions. But we go to Tucson, and at the time, I remember it was Jesus Becerra's son. I don't know if you remember Jesus Becerra. He was an evangelist out of Tucson, and he was like a powerful evangelist. And he'd be like, God's going to touch you. He's going to touch you from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. That's how he would preach. And so we knew about him because he would come to San Marcos. And one day his son got up and he was in the choir and he testified. And he was like, Dad, I want to be like you when I grow up. I remember hearing those words and I was like, man, I wish I had that kind of relationship with my father. Because I don't have it. And so, Tucson is around the time of Father's Day. So I remember Pastor Pettis, he preached a sermon about fathers, and he might have mentioned something about forgiveness. I don't remember. That's how it sounded to me, And so I remember going to the altar and I remember praying, and I remember God dealing with me specifically like, I can do a whole lot more in your life if you will let things go, And God was like, me and you, we cannot go any further until you let this go. And I got scared. Wow. And I got scared because I was like, God, you're already doing so much in my life. Like, don't take this away from me. Like, I don't want you to stop working in my life because I'm angry towards my father. And I remember that day at the altar, I let go of whatever anger that I had towards my father. And I didn't think about it anymore after that. I let it go. And I told him I was sorry for the things that I had done, because I really, really hurt my father as far as like, I'm sure I hurt him mentally, but physically, I really did hurt my father. And I feel so bad about those. Even now, my dad's gone and he didn't hold none of that stuff against me, but I feel really bad about the way I treated him. Now that I think about all the stuff that I did, I feel really bad about it, and he wasn't angry anymore when he finally surrendered, and, but I told him I was sorry and I let go of that. And that was it. I was free after that, It took him probably about 6 years where my mom was in church and he was in and out of church. My mom went on an invasion team to New York with the San Antonio church, and she came back and my father was waiting for her, and they weren't living together, but he found out where she was living at, and he got into a fight with her. He hit her and somebody heard, they called the cops, and he got put in jail for about a year. And he was looking at doing like 15 years in prison. So, wow. The crazy part of all that was that my mom, she would still go see him, and he would, he had time in prison to like sober up, because there was no drugs, there was no alcohol. And so, my mom would, just tell him what's going on in the family, because he would ask about me and my wife and my kids. At that time, we were pastoring. this is a couple of years forward. We were pastoring in Seguin. And so I would get invited to go preach places, and they would make a flyer, and I would always take one of my mom, because it had my picture on it, you know what I mean? And I would take her a flyer, and I said, look, I want to go preach over here. I saved this for you. And so she would take it, and she would take it to my dad. And she would have these conversations with my dad. My dad would be like, how's Jay? How's Angie? How the kids? What's going on? And she would tell him, and then she would give him like the flyer or whatever. And he would take it back, and in jail, he would have it up on his wall. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so one day, one of his friends came in, and I always tell this story the way my dad tells the story. So it was a friend of his, and his friend had gold teeth. He had all gold teeth. And so when he would talk, he would smile because he had all gold teeth. And so he said that one day his friend went into his, dorm or by his wall or something. And he said, who are these people? And my dad's like, well, that's my wife. That's my younger son. That's his wife. This is my son and his family. And his friend's looking at the wall. He's like, your son's a preacher? And he's like, yeah, my son's a preacher. And he's like, and your other son and your wife, they're in the song service? He's like, yeah, and he said that his friend looked at him. He goes, Pete, why are you here, Pete? Like smiling with his gold teeth. He's like, why are you here, Pete? And my dad was like, I'm here because I broke the law. That's why we're all here. He's like, nah, Pete, why are you here? He's like, none of us have anybody. Our people don't love us, but your people love you. God loves you. You have a church. He's like, why are you here, Pete? And my dad said that he like something snapped in his head, and he was like, what are you doing here? And so after that, he started to go to church in prison, because he was in prison for a little under a year, I think. And he started serving God in jail, and he got out, and he started going to the church again faithfully. So by that time, I was already pastoring in another city. So I didn't really see all the conversion that took place in my dad. I just know that I got a lot less phone calls from my mom saying that they were fighting and that kind of thing. And I remember one day my mom was like, you know what, your dad, he's never going to change. And I said, Mom, stop talking like that. You're going to get what you speak. And I was like, and you need to be nice to him. How do you expect for him to change if you're not nice? You can't hold all that stuff against him, if he's trying to change. And my dad tells me a story that he had gotten into an argument with my mom, and he went to my grandmother's house. That's where my dad would go to drink and get away from my mom and do his drugs and stuff. But this time he's saved. He's sitting there, it's cold, and he's laying in this bed that has a bunch of bumps in it, and he's looking up at the ceiling. He's like, I don't want to live like this no more. He didn't drink or anything like that, but he was just kind of like, I need to make things right between me and my wife, my mom. And so he went to church that morning. Pastor Roman was our pastor at the time, Pastor Roman Gutierrez. They went in the office and they talked. And my dad said he had this conversation with Pastor Roman. And after that, he said he never went back to doing what he was doing. And him and my mom would just work things out. And to this day, I want to know what that conversation was. But if I ask Pastor Roman right now, he'll be like, I don't, kind of thing. So, but after that, my dad was a different person, and he dedicated his life to the service of the church. And he lived 15 years, 18 years of his life, his best life, and, he got to see my grandkids and my kids and had a good relationship with them. And,
Praise God.
God totally restored his life, Well,
that's incredible. That's incredible. So large part of your testimony is what God did in your parents too. That's incredible. I wanted to ask you before we go to our break is, I'm trying to think about this from the perspective of the church, and to be able, it was in the last Prescott conference, Pastor Richard Ruby preached a message about thank God for your church.
Absolutely.
We showed that in our Wednesday night service.
Absolutely.
It was powerful message.
Yeah.
But he mentioned something, and this, a fundamental of our fellowship, which is we've got to build our church on conversions. We've got to build our churches on people that God is saving rather than, church transfers or religious people, things like that. And your family, what a powerful example of that. But, along with the territory comes a lot of problems. This is why churches don't build on converts, because you brought a lot of problems in with you. And you were mentioned to me earlier before we started recording that how you wish that somebody would have taken your dad under their wing a little bit sooner than they did, because, well, why don't you tell us? Because I think people who are going to hear this, pastors and disciples and people who are trying to serve the Lord, we're going to have to take on some hard cases as churchgoers and as people who are trying to do the will of God. And, so why don't you encourage those that are listening about why that's important?
Yeah. When I think back and I look at those early days in the church in San Marcos, I don't think that there was guys that were my father's age or close to his age that were willing to deal with my dad. My dad was a wild guy. Sometimes he would show up to the church drunk. And I remember one day he had, I was in a band and my dad was accusing my mom of my mom messing with somebody in the band. And so my dad showed up to the practice because my mom was there, my brother was there, and he had a band. And so my mom was there hanging out and my dad showed up. And mind you, he's drunk. And so I had heard about what my dad did, and I grabbed my dad. I said, come here right now. So I grabbed him, and then I grabbed that guy. I said, are you doing something with my mom? I need you to tell him right now, because this is what he's thinking. I confronted my dad, and I didn't do it out of hate. I did it because I was like, no, let's settle this right now. The problem is when you have men like that, you have to deal with them like men. They're not children. They may not be mature because they got these things going on in their life, but they're still a man, And I think that it was very difficult for some of the people in the church to deal with my father because, it was messy. He had attitude. I think if my dad back then, if he had a friend, one guy that was willing to be like, Pete, what are you doing? Stop this, or I'm going to go pick you up. You're having it out with Joanne? Okay, I'm going to go pick you up. We're going to go get some coffee, or we're going to go hang out. You're going to let it out. And then I'm going to pray for you. And then I'm going to send you back home. I think if my father had that, I think that he would have gotten saved or really locked into the church way before that. But because he was just so wild, I think it was kind of intimidating for some guys to deal with my dad because of his attitude at the time. And just sometimes the things he would say, But I think that when you build your church off of people like that and you give yourself to them and you're there with them and you're working through their problems, you're working through the times where they're suffering, you're working through whatever foolish thoughts they have, and you're there, they appreciate that. I know that we don't owe anybody anything. Jesus did everything. I understand that. But I'm extremely grateful for my mother church. I would do anything for my mother church because of the love that they showed us. And when I say my dad, I mean like the pastors that tried, because there was a lot of pastors. We had a lot of pastors that they did try, and they let him come back to church. But I think it's very important for churches to remember that if you want converts that are going to give their life for the things of God, then you have to be willing to work through their nonsense, because there's going to be a lot of them. Sure, you can take a religious person and they could be like, praise the Lord, everything is good, God is great, and they'll give and that kind of thing. But I can tell you, if some new wind of doctrine comes by and they feel compelled to go that direction, they're not going to have no second thoughts about leaving the church, But when you take somebody and they get saved, they really get saved in your church, and they have problems and they fight with their wife, or they fight with their kids, or, they're involved in pornography, or, are in drugs or something like that. When you help them and you help them work through those problems, they feel indebted to the church. And that's what they should feel. They should feel that, because honestly, how many people come into our churches that they have real love from our families? That's not the people that we work with. We work with people that are rejected. We work with people that nobody wants them. Their mothers hate them. Their fathers disown them. They don't get along with anybody in their family because they're the black sheep, or however you want to look at it. Or they look at them as they're not worth anything and they're just a lost cause. But when you come and you say, hey, man, I love you, bro, you're going to make it. Nobody in their life tells them stuff like that. And they're going to be like, nah, man, but I messed up. I got drunk last night and I don't think I'm going to make it. You'd be like, hey, man, Noah got drunk. You're going to be all right. Let's just move on from this. God's going to help you. He's going to deliver you. I think that's super important. I think that we forget what our churches were built off of. And that was a bunch of hippies, drug addict hippies that finally got saved and got converted. I can't think about this. I think about Pastor Warner. I think about Pastor Mitchell, polar opposites when he first came into the church. You hear the story of the older lady that took care of him and let him move in. It's like, that's insane. You know what I mean? But she was like, I believe in this guy. Think about how fruitful our churches would be if everybody was like that. The problem is it just takes time. It takes patience. You have to pray. You have to be able to look past things that happen, you know what I mean? And try to work with them. But it's super important because we're in the business of restoring people, And yeah, sure, we're preaching fellowship. And yes, we hold up a standard, but not everybody comes in with that standard in their life. They grow up and there's violations that happen and things like that happen. And they don't know what that means to have standards in their life. And they need somebody to show them or to be patient with them, to be like, hey, man, probably not a good idea to do that kind of stuff. My father didn't, when he passed away in 2020, he didn't leave me anything. My father didn't have life insurance or nothing like that. He didn't leave us land or anything like that. But what my father left me with was a legacy of God's grace, because I saw God's grace through his life. Because you're talking almost a 25-year span of time. And my dad came in, he would come out, come in, come out, come in, come out. And then finally he said, I need to get this right, because God spoke to him and he finally listened. And when he finally listened, God blessed him. God wasn't like, well, you messed up, man, I'm sorry, I can't help you. No, that's not the nature of God. And so what he did leave me with was that God can restore anybody's life. God gave my dad dignity. My dad didn't have it. He had lost all kinds of respect from people because of the things that he did. He would borrow money, lie to people, steal from people. He was a manipulator, all that kind of stuff. But when he got saved, he really got saved. And he tried to, my dad tried to make things right with people that he had hurt. And it was up to them whether they were going to receive it or not. But he really felt like God has restored my life. And you could see it. My kids, they grow up, they didn't know none of that stuff. The only thing that they know is the stories that I tell them. But they didn't know, they know him as my grandfather, when he was alive. My grandfather would take them food at the high school, they were spoiled, because that's my dad. That's how God had changed him. He finally, crazy story about my dad was that he had had an accident in his work truck. He was a concrete, he would work the concrete trucks, he would take the cement trucks. And so he had CDL and stuff like that. And one day he was drunk and coked up, and he wrecked his cement truck. He flipped it over.
Oh, man.
And he wrecked
into
a family, and he lost his job. They gave him a drug test, found he was on drugs, blah, 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 blah. When he got out of jail, he was trying to find work, and he couldn't find work because of his past. And he was like, I think I'm going to claim disability. And I'm like, you're not going to get disability, Dad. But he was like, I'm going to try. So they wouldn't give it to him. And mind you, he's in church now. I said, Dad, why don't you tithe? Why don't you tithe? Honor God. Whatever jobs you get, tithe, trust God. My dad began to tithe. He began to honor God. And so one day he saw that there was an opening at the company that he used to work for. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to try it. What's the worst they can say? No. He's like, I'm going to try it. So he goes and he fills out an application, and he tells them, I used to work for y'all a couple of years back. I had an incident and, but I'm a different person now. So, well, we're going to look at over your application, or we're going to look at your records, blah, 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 blah. And so my dad gets a phone call and they said, when did you say that you worked for this company? And so he's giving them the year and the date. And they're like, we don't have any record that you ever worked for this company. He's like, oh, maybe it was a different one, but he knew it was that one. He said, maybe it was a different one. And so they gave him a job. He got his license back, his CDL.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And for the same company that he got fired from for driving while drunk and with drugs in his system. And God did a miracle.
Nothing but a miracle.
Yeah, it was a miracle, And so back to what I was saying, is the thing that my father left me was a legacy of God's grace, because I saw it through his life. And that changed me, because I knew that if God could change him and restore my family, then he can restore anybody. When he passed away in 2020, I started doing a podcast like yours. I called it Project Restore, because that was the thing that God had put in my heart. And I said, if you can change his life, God, you can change anybody's life. If you can restore our family, you can restore anybody's family. And that's what I tell myself when when you pastor and you're pioneering, you're trying to win people. And man, it is difficult. It's difficult. You want them to get it.
Extremely.
You want them to understand it. And you forget how gracious God is. And you forget that God is doing something behind the scenes. You have no idea, And so I started doing that, because I was like, man, if God can change him, he can change anybody. God's gracious, man. And, and let me just, say this to anybody who's pastoring. You'll have people who are, you look at them and you're like, there's no way. No way. There's no way that these people are going to figure it out. But man, let me tell you something. When they do, there will be the greatest assets in your church. They're going to be your biggest givers. They're going to be the people that are loyal to headship. And somebody's talking bad, you're not going to talk like that about my pastor. They're going to be the people that see other people on the streets, that are people that are bums and that are, whatever. And they're going to be the ones reaching out to them. You know why? Because of God's grace. My brother took a picture of my father one day. They were street preaching downtown San Marcos. That's where all the bars are at. And he took a picture of my father. My father was praying with the guy. He was dirty. His clothes were ripped up. And after my dad had prayed with that man was like, can I please give you a hug? And my dad was like, absolutely. And my dad gave him a hug. Most of us would see that guy and be like, what's the point? They're not going to respond correct. They might not even come to church, But that's the legacy of my father, is the grace of God. And that's what he taught me. And that's what we have to have in our day.
It's powerful. Yeah, we really, what that requires is you got to have a vision for people. It's the same. It's whether or not we're looking at people to see if they're going to be fruitful and productive in our church, or whether it's just on outreach and we're believing God to save people. You have to be able to see things that people can't even see in themselves. And I'm often reminded of that, like the story of Moses. When he's 80 years old, he's been a shepherd for 40 years of his life, and he's basically at that point, he's thinking that's it. That's all my life is going to be. He's not thinking that there's anything in the future. And then God is presenting him with this incredible opportunity, and he's like, he can't even see it. He can't even fathom that God would bring him back into a place of destiny. So this is something that I try to preach to people, is you've got to be able to see the way that God sees. And the way that God sees is that he sees something in us that we can't even see ourselves, right? And as pastors, as people in churches, we've got to have that kind of vision for people to look down the road and see what is possible with God. And that's not an automatic for everybody. We're going to take a break here in a second. But before we do, Pastor Jason, you've been very gracious with your time and explaining your story. But I want you to maybe speak to the person who is listening right now, and either they're not saved, or they're on the fringes, or they're maybe they're not serious really about serving God because of this right here, because maybe they're saying to themselves, I couldn't ever live that kind of life, or I see people in church and I'm not really that kind of person. And why don't you take a moment to show them the plan of the gospel for their life and how, because you've been changed in such a powerful way, your family has been radically changed. Why don't you give them a little hope to trust in Jesus and believe him for salvation?
Okay. We do these podcasts, because we talk about discipleship and stuff like that and missionary works, but ultimately everything that we do is for the sake of the gospel. The gospel is that you can be changed and transformed. My story, my family's story, we didn't grow up in church. In fact, we probably knew more about witchcraft and religion and things like that and drinking and Hank Williams Jr. and all that kind of stuff more than anything else. But I can tell you, when we finally surrendered our life to Jesus, God began to change our life. It doesn't matter what you've done. I can sit here for hours with Pastor Adam and tell him all the horrible things that I did growing up. I can tell you about all the horrible things my father did growing up, my brother, my mother, all of us. Our family was honestly on our way to hell. But by the grace of God, God stepped in, he found us, and he reached down to rescue us. We could not offer anything to God. We weren't rich. We only got a high school education. We could do nothing with that. We didn't come from money, nothing like that. But God in his grace reached down and said, I want to save this family. I want to restore this family. And that's exactly what God did. And you're listening and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but you don't know my life. You're right. I don't know your life. But God knows your life. The Bible says he knows how many hairs are on your head. The Bible says that from the beginning of time, before time, God saw you and had a plan for you. That verse in Jeremiah, the Bible says that he called Jeremiah to be a prophet to the nations when he was in his mother's womb. That means that God has a plan. I don't know what that plan is for your life. I do know that it's special. And I do know that if you would surrender your life, you could know that plan. If you were to ask me when I got saved, when I was 18, that I was going to become a missionary in Bluefields, Nicaragua, I would have told you were crazy. I didn't even know if I believed in God. But I said, God, if you're able to change my life, I challenge you to change my life. And God changed my life. I couldn't, people always ask, what would you do differently in your life? I can't say anything about it because God orchestrated everything and he changed my life and made me the man that I am today. And I'm telling you, from somebody who's lived for God for over 25, 26 years, that if God can change me, God can change you. And that doesn't matter how broken your life is. It doesn't matter. If you would just surrender your heart and give Jesus your life, he could change it. And it's one step at a time. The easiest thing you can do is just go to church. You know why? Because you just go and you sit there. You just have to drive there. That's the hardest part. But when you're there, listen, say, God, I'm here. I need you to speak to me and me alone. And God will. God will single you out. You'll feel like you're the only person in the room, and God will make himself real to you. If you're like on the fence and you're wondering, pray, God, show me your love. I want to see your love. And if you do that, God will change your life forever. He'll change your family's life. That's my testimony. God didn't just change me. God didn't just touch my wife. He touched my wife, and then she witnessed to me, and God touched me. And then I witnessed to my family, and God restored my family. So God loves you. He doesn't care about your foolishness, doesn't care about your sins. And the Bible says that Jesus Christ came and he died while we were yet sinners. That means that when we were sinners, he died for us. He didn't die for us when we got better. He died for us when we were at the worst, when we were putting our middle finger up to God and saying, God, how could you do this to me? I hate you. I can't stand you. Why would you bring me into this world? Nobody wants me. Nobody cares for me. Nobody loves me. But the Bible says that Jesus died at that time when we were at our worst. So it doesn't matter what you've done, where you've been. God just wants you. He made you for himself, and he loves you, and he wants to help you. So he can do a miracle.
God, thank you.
In your life.
Amen. So if you heard that and there's a part of you that is being drawn by the Holy Spirit to know Jesus, we want to encourage you to find a local church, find a place. That you're going to find in our show notes a link to cfmmap.org, and you can find a fellowship church that is close to you, hopefully. And if not, you can cry out to God. Let him know that you're hearing his voice. And if you'll do that, I believe God will lead you exactly where you need to go. Amen. We want to thank you for your time and for listening. We're going to come back in just a minute. I have some more questions to ask, because up until now, we've only discussed your life before salvation, how you got saved. I want to ask you about your family, your marriage, your decision to go pastor, your journey to the mission field. And so there's a lot more to hear on the second half of this interview. But in order to do that, you would need to become a premium subscriber. So if you want to go and check the link down in the show notes, you will find instructions on how to do that. And we just want to say thank you for our free listeners. This will be the end of our show, but if you want to hear the rest of this interview, go check it out. It's only $3 a month, and everything goes to world evangelism. So thank you, Pastor Garcia. We appreciate your time.
I appreciate y'all.